Thank you all for being here. I hope that you can enjoy the slideshow that's going, that Dan and others put together. I'm Mark, I'm Russ's son, and what we would like to do in the coming minutes is to give an opportunity for people to share any reflections or stories, that memories of Russ that you'd like to share with the group. And we have nothing formal planned. We're hoping that people can just, unfortunately, you're going to need to literally step forward, and I hope that that doesn't discourage anyone, but for various reasons, we've been asked to do that rather than pass a mic. So I'm going to start by just asking anyone who would like to get things rolling to come on up.
And I would say also the reason that we're doing it this way is that we know there's people watching the live stream, and I had a lot of people email me this week saying, their condolences they couldn't be here. So we want to make sure that people can see who's talking and hear them well. I'll kick it off with a few things. I have a long list of things I learned from my dad, and I'm not going to do all of them here, at least at once. They're bulleted points. So here are a few. Some Liechties have a weeping gene, and including Dad. He could cry. He could laugh so hard he could cry, but he could cry a lot too. You could get him crying with a movie or whatever. He would definitely cry, and he would have been crying this morning for sure, having heard what was being said about him. Both because I think he would have thought it was like over the top, perhaps, but I think it was good for us to hear him. Another thing I learned, that doing a good job is rewarding. A clean car is next to godliness, although I could never actually match him. Being part of a faith community is essential. Matching hubcaps matter. You should always put a Liechty Motors Archbold, Ohio decal on all of your cars. When you put that decal on your car, it should be horizontal. Don't fall into the trap of putting it parallel to the company badging on the car. Very important. All tractors should be green, although he did have a red, as Chris noted, he did have a red lawn tractor. Working together can be fun, especially if it ends in some sort of treat, and that was a part of the stories this morning. I knew I could get Dad to work on almost anything if you offer him a meal or a snack afterwards. He was in. And I would say also, along with that saying yes to any road trip, if it involves a chance for a good meal, and even if it doesn't, because driving is fun. So I'll leave it at that for now. So please feel free to come forward if you'd like to share.
Cousin Jim, and I wanted to say that what Chris shared this morning is something that we see Allen's down in Florida, live not too far away from them, down in Sarasota in the winter. So we were talking after Russ passed, and we were going over everything that was said about Russ this morning, basically, and all so true and so fitting, and not to take anything away from that, but what crossed my mind at the time of Russ passing was the Liechty family was amazing. And I think back on my mom's life, and every one of my aunts, there we go. She spoke so highly of Russ, and every one of the aunts and uncles, even the in-laws, amazingly enough, but I'll stick to the Liechties themselves. It was an amazing family. They were all very bright. They didn't all pursue the same paths, but it was such fun to grow up with them.
More than one of you mentioned that it is hard to speak of what Russ did and who Russ was without also referring to Marge, because they were thoroughly married. And and stayed married in a time when homes become a bit more fragile. Some 15, maybe 20 years ago, my wife Marie and I sat down with Russ and Marge, and we discovered that just on our own, we were trying to be financially helpful to a student here and there. They in Asia, especially India and Nepal, and Vic and Marie in Africa. So we said, well, let's join forces together. And Russ became the administrative leader of that effort. I was asked to become the chief fundraiser. And so we functioned for a number of years until our birthdays accumulated a little bit too much. And now we have younger and enthusiastic successors carrying on an effort that has grown from helping one or two people here and there to a fund of $100,000 a year and continuing. So always in that time of organizing, we could rely on Marge's amazing memory. She made sure our asking lists had the people on that should be on there. And Russ was careful with organization, with an agenda, with minutes, and all of this in such good grace. In this wonderful memorial service this morning, I was so pleased to see how one could go from funny little things to a tribute to his deep faith in God. Some Christians are stuffy and repulsive, not Russ. He was able to speak out of his heart that loved God and could quietly and effectively speak of that to others. And certainly that kind of faith will be contagious.
I'm Joe Springer, a longtime neighbor of Russ. What Vic didn't mention is that fund supporting international students is open for contributions every year. They can be sent to Goshen, to College Mennonite Church. And yes, and of course, not just for the memorial though, but you can give specifically as a memorial to Russ. In thinking of the many, many encounters I have had with Russ as from childhood on, it's almost surprising to me that for over 20 years, I met almost weekly for breakfast with Russ, along with several other men from the congregation. And I think it's perhaps characteristic for Russ that in that very different kind of encounter from what I would have had encounters as a child, I almost didn't learn anything new about Russ. I knew it all along. And that's part of the special character that he lived and was in many of our lives. We all know of Russ's mechanical abilities. I scored below the chart on mechanical abilities on an aptitude test, and yet one of the things I did with Russ once was help with his big semi restoration. He had the breakfast group help him swing the engine, I think both out and in. In any case, we had a wonderful breakfast provided by Marge at those times when we visited his garage. But I'm grateful for everything that he represented, everything that he lived out in his life, and I'm also grateful for the progeny that he produced and the many wonderful things that they are doing and the ways they interact with my wife Joanne and me also. Thank you.
My name is Michael Shear, and I had the pleasure of just practically living with the Liechty's for a fair amount of my young life. One of my earliest memories is bouncing on the front seat of Russ's 1919 Dodge over on College Avenue. I must have been like 4 years old, and I think you were there, Mark. bouncing right with me. And throughout my life, the 1990 Dodge is sort of this recurring element where Russ had like sent out a dial to be re-chromed or something, and it just sort of gradually throughout time got more and more restored. And I do remember that it must have been somewhere around 2016, 2017, that Russ drove the car fully restored and beautiful into our cul-de-sac to see my dad. And it's so fitting that he finished it. And then I remember hearing that he'd sold it, which was sort of this amazing thing that your life's project, you finish it and give it to someone else to enjoy. And so characteristic. Anyway, lovely man.
He did sell it.
Yeah, he did.
He didn't give it away. I'm Alan Liechty. Just wanted to tell you, I am of an age now where I'm entitled to tell the same story more than once. So if some of you have heard it before, bear with me. But my first memories of my Uncle Russ were probably when I was about 5 years old, and he had just gotten a new Plymouth convertible, and he was proudly giving his nieces and nephews rides through the streets of Archbold. And I don't know why, but we didn't see, living in Archbold, we didn't see Uncle Russ and Aunt Marge as often as we saw some of the other aunts and uncles, but it was always a special time when they would come to town. And I always remember the uncles getting together and discussing, some would say arguing, but it was an interesting conversation amongst the uncles, good people, and we really appreciated Uncle Russ. I'm a nephew of Russ. Mom was Mary. She was the oldest sibling in the family, of the Liechty family. And like Jim says, you just can't imagine what those Christmases and those celebrations were like. I mean, the number of kids, we were all over. And then the uncles and aunts, they were all in the kitchen, and the smells and the mounds of good food and the loud discussions and plainly stated opinions, and they were loving, though. People also don't realize, I think sometimes, that Russ could be critical. He could be very explicit, and he could. His loving people allowed him to accept, not just isolate the good part, but he could still love people and be very, very critical of some of the aspects of things. And something I learned. I think a lot of it came from Grandma. She was a very accepting person. Grandpa bought the material for her dresses. He'd go to Aunt Melinda's place uptown and come home with fabric that she was expected then to make her clothes out of and wear. Grandpa was a unique person. Russ was the very youngest in the family, and as such, there was always often conversation about, Russ had motorcycles. He had Harley Davidson motorcycles, and I remember the conversation. I talked about Russ later, and he denied it. But I remember the aunts said that they saw him standing up on the seat of the Harley going down the road with his arms out. And Russ said it never happened, but the aunts were they were questioning whether they should go to Grandpa about it. But that would have been a big step, but I don't know if they did or not. But Russ also wasn't afraid to appreciate really fun things. I mean, the cars, the chrome, the beauty of things. And being around him, it was never drudgery. You didn't learn things the hard way, so it was a wonderful time. Anyway, we'll miss him.
Mark Smucker, I have to put my hearing aids back in. Kind of random things come to mind when you think about people, and the thing that keeps coming back to me is so random I don't even know why I want to tell it to you, but I would have been 10 years old or 11 years old, and Russ took me to the auto dealership, the Dodge dealership, and it was closed because Grandpa had just died. And so it was, I think that was 61, he died, but there was a red 1960 Valiant in there that we went. It was after Grandpa was gone, but Wes hadn't taken over the dealership yet. And we looked at that car, and Russ said, boy, I sure would like to have this. And, it was the red 1960 Valiant. Those of you who remember those things would recognize that was kind of a funky looking car, but I don't know why I remember that, but I do. Probably because Russ was taking me and paying attention to me and showing me something that was pretty unique. And like many of the Liechty's, I definitely inherited the car gene.
I'm Harley Yoder. And I got introduced to the Liechty family in 1980 when I had the privilege of living in Dublin with Joe and Linda as we were putting an addition onto their house. And they convinced me to get my GED and go to Goshen College. So the following year, I was a confused, insecure freshman here on campus, knowing I needed to be in college but not knowing what I should be doing here. So I would spend some time with Russ in his counseling office, because I knew if I went to a counselor, he would tell me what to do. And Russ never told me what to do. And every time I left his office, I knew what I had to do. And he kept a personal interest in me through the years, even after graduating college. He would always want to know how I'm doing, what I'm doing, and I wasn't just this ex-Amish kid that didn't know if he wanted to go into history or into medicine. Russ was one of these people. He took an individual interest in every person that he counseled, and he was an encouraging force for me all through college, and I really appreciate that.
Having rightly emphasized Dad's nurturing qualities, I thought I'd say a word about what it was like to be disciplined and, yes, punished by the nurturing father. I grew up in this church, and have you ever seen a church that is so obviously meant to be a track that you sprint around at full speed? So I did for much of my childhood, and when it got to be a little too much, I'd stop beside Dad, he'd put his arm around me, and he'd somehow grab my ear and give it just a little twist that told me, okay, we've had enough of that now. So there was an ear theme about traveling as well. We had these enormous 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s sedans. And if Jane and I, and maybe eventually Mark, were getting into it. It was probably my fault. And Dad could drive straight down the road, never look aside, the car would never swerve, and he could extend his arms by feet to catch me cowering in the corner and grab my ear and give it a twist again. So there was an ear theme. The most memorable one, though, we were in Madison, so I am somewhere between ages 7 and 10. I'm going to guess I'm 8, maybe 9, probably 8. I've got a watch for my birthday. This is great. I like to go down and play in the woods below Dudgeon School, beautiful woods and lake. I thought I was allowed to go there. Mom recently informed me I was not allowed to go there. She did not know I was there. But I would go down there and play. I don't want to come home. I'd look at my watch, time to go, and I think, if I turned my watch back, what can I get away with there? So I turned my watch back, and this was, must have stopped. Wretched little liar. So it must have stopped. So I get away with this once, maybe twice, and then it becomes a little questionable. And at some point, Dad spanks me. I do it again. I cannot pull back what was going through my tiny little mind. And then at one point, he was going to spank me with a belt. And he took out the belt, leaned me over his knee, but he couldn't do it, and he cried, and so I never did that again.
For those of you who don't know, I'm Paul Friesen. My wife Bonnie, we met Russ and Marge in this church, gathering rooms mostly. They were leading a college-age class for gathering after church meetings. And somewhere along the line of Bonnie and I getting together, we decided we wanted some counsel. And I didn't know that Russ was a professional counselor, but I knew that he was somebody we knew that he was somebody that would be able to help us in our decision to get married. What was in store for us if we were to get married, and how do we do this right? And we actually gathered 3 couples, one our age, one Marge and Russ's age, and then another one in between there. You may know Roseberry and Larry Rupp, sorry. Having a tough time with names nowadays, but anyway, the 4 couples of us met several times and discussed, how marriage works and sometimes how marriage doesn't work, and how do we get through the tough parts. So that's how Bonnie and I got to know Russ and Marge, especially. And then when we were married, Russ offered up one of his voluminous sedans for a getaway from our wedding site to our celebration in the park. And that was a very nice ride. Not necessarily just for the car's reason, but I had a new bride next to me. That was my experience with Russ and Marge.
I'm Randy Graber. Sherlyn is my wife. She's a niece of Russ and Marge. Russ helped me solve a big problem. I was a farmer in Iowa. We inherited one of the John Deeres that Wayne restored, Russ's brother. It was an H, and I had a terrible time with that John Deere. It kept going through spark plugs, and nobody could answer that. So I was out in Ohio, or out in Indiana, no, it was Ohio, and asked Russ once.
And he said, what you need to do is you need to go to your John Deere store. And by the way, Dan, his son, was standing there. What you need to do is go to your John Deere store and find an 80-some-year-old mechanic, and he'll be able to solve that problem for you. Dan looked at his dad and said, Dad, he's not going to be able to find an 80-year-old some mechanic in a John Deere store. There's not going to be any left. But I followed his advice anyway, because Russ had told me to get a high-performance plug. So I went to the John Deere store, my store, and I found the oldest mechanic I could find that had been there for years, and I told him what Uncle Russ had told me. And he said, you know, that's probably right. He got me some high-performance plugs. I don't think I ever replaced a spark plug in that thing tractor the rest of the time I had it, so Russ knew what he was talking about.
My name's Johnny Christ. I married into the layman side of Doris Liechty's side. In the 1970s, here at Goshen College as a student, Russ Liechty was a legend, and I was trying to break into this family. And there are only three of us. My wife's family had 6, and then the crew of 50 or whatever, and kept hearing all these unimaginable stories of Uncle Russ, and I needed an edge in to try to get Ann. And we were invited down to the house. Aunt Marge was preparing some meal, and because I'm a car guy, I was privileged to be with Uncle Russ as he was changing oil in the truck. And we got to talk and had a great time, and he very carefully poured 6 quarts of oil in the head of this truck, and carefully with the little rags and stuff just made it all tidy, put the lid back on, and he said, I forgot to put the plug in the bottom of the oil pan. It was a huge gift to me. I was like a sophomore high school or a junior, senior in college, and I saw Russ Liechty, the dean of students, as a human being, and it was a huge gift to me. Thank you, Uncle Russ.
This is a silly story, so I'm already crying. I had the pleasure of having Russ as my grandpa. He was always down for an adventure, and one thing in particular that I remember is that when I was probably in 4th grade, Grandma and Grandpa took Elsie and Naomi and I on a Laura Ingalls Wilder trip through the Midwest. We followed all the spots that the Ingalls Wilder family lived in. And we also stopped at Noah's Ark Water Park in Wisconsin. And as meticulous as Grandpa was, there was one thing he was not meticulous about during that trip, and that was latching the rooftop carrier closed. And we were flying down the highway in the middle of Wisconsin, and the rooftop carrier flies open, and there are sleeping bags all over the highway. So I remember on that trip having to turn around, Grandpa walking along the side of the highway and picking up Elsie and mine and Naomi's sleeping bags along the way. And it was just something to laugh about afterwards. But he was definitely an example for us in living a life of adventure and going places and meeting people, and I miss him a lot.
I'm I'm Starla Graber, and I have one more example of how he just connected with people of all ages. He happens to share a birthday with our oldest daughter, and they also shared a birthday with our next door neighbor, who was probably 10 years older than Russ. So for a number of years, we had a triplet birthday party at our house with a 4 or 5-year-old little girl and 2 older gentlemen who each went out and found a gift for this little girl themselves and had a relationship with her. So it didn't matter how old you were or weren't, you were a person to Russ, and we just appreciated and enjoyed those times so much.
Emma's story inspires me to tell another story about packing. One thing I learned from my dad was how to pack a suitcase. He could stuff an unbelievable amount of stuff in a suitcase. And he told me, pack to the corners, pack to the corners. And I still do. But I remember one incident where his packing skills, how to say it, perhaps backfired, and this was on our first family trip abroad. He had packed a year's worth of luggage, and Mom too, but it was, let's say that it was packed more tightly than the zippers could handle. And so I was only 9 at the time, but I still remember at the airport in Tokyo watching our luggage come down the conveyor belt, having exploded, and here comes a toothbrush and a shirt, and yeah, we didn't let him forget that one. So.
Hi, my name is Prashansa. Since Emma's were super weepy, I feel okay about talking. I'm one of the recipients of the International Scholarship Fund they were talking about. So I've known Russ and March since 2012, and I would not have been able to finish at Goshen if it wasn't for them. Russ bought me my first bike, and then everything that I couldn't fix, he helped me fix it. Even really silly things, I couldn't get the seat to go down, so I would come over and he would help me. I didn't know how to change the tires, and then he would help me with that. Russ and March took me to go buy my first winter coat. And then they were very worried when I wore it in September. So that was a fun time for me. One of my favorite Christmas things that we did together was that they would make these walnut mold cookies, and the whole process took so long, and it was so fun, and I really appreciated being just a part of the family and never feeling like an outsider or never feeling homesick whenever I was with them. Thanks.
I'm Gil Liechty. I've had a lot of uncles, every one of them, everything you'd ever want in an uncle. Great men, all of them. There was one difference with my Uncle Russ. He was my friend.
Hi, my name is Simelwe. I'm from South Africa. I know the Liechty family through Joe and Anna Swatsky, who were in South Africa for years. And there are a couple of traits that I've come to appreciate about the family. One, competitiveness. That one is brutal. But caring and hospitality. These are the ones that I have experienced in all the family members that I have met. I am also one of the recipients of international scholarships at Goshen College when I was here a couple of years ago. I experienced Russ and Marge's caring a number of times since I have met them. A couple of times when Russ had just come out, I think he had just come out of hospital, and he and Marge stopped by the house, Jen and Peter's house, to drop off a birthday card. I think it was a birthday card for Asigo. And when Russ had just passed, Marge sent in a message. She had missed my sending me a birthday message, and this was a couple of days after Russ had passed. It's like you can just not send a message, a birthday message. You have a lot of going on, and I think this is one of the greatest gifts that they have been able to teach to many of us, to care about those around us and to provide hospitality for any and everyone who knocks at the door. And this I will appreciate for until I live and am able to carry on the same because I have learned from them. Thank you.
My name is Alia Deegan. I first met Russ and Marge in the 80s. Sorry, I'm going to get a little teary. Through Joe and Linda in Dublin, where I'm from. And when Joe and Linda, myself, and Willie, my husband, who's here, became really good friends in Ireland, and our kids became really good friends, and they all grew up together. But over the years, we met Russ and Marge when they would come to Dublin to visit Joe and Linda. And we just got to know them pretty well. And when we decided to move to the States, we applied for a visa and we got one. And I had been talking to Linda and I was saying, you know, maybe Willie's got a cousin in Rhode Island, maybe that's where we go. And she said, well, you've met so many people from Goshen, you know, what would you think about that? And I had visited Joe and Linda here in 1988, and I thought Goshen was really nice. I was in this church here and walked down 8th Street where I now live, never suspecting that that's where I'd be. But over those years in Dublin, anytime Russ and Marge came, we just felt as a family a very huge connection to both Marge and Russ. And when it came time for us to move here, Joe and Linda were still in Ireland, and we the day we arrived at O'Hare, Russ and Marge were living in Chicago at the time, but they rented a van to bring us to Dublin, and Mark was there too, came to the airport and just welcomed us with open arms. And people had said to me in Ireland, would you not go somewhere where there's an Irish community? Because really at that time I think we were it here. But we did have a community, because we had the Lichtys and Russ and Marge. And, the one thing that I found, even we're here 26 years this month, and the one thing that I found that even after all that time is people are still very curious as to how we ended up in Goshen. Like, why did you move from Ireland to Goshen, of all places? And so when I say, I talk about our connection with the Lichtys and Russ and Marge, well, they want to know what Lichtys. And so I have to play a little bit of that Mennonite game that you all do. And so when I mention Russ's name and Marge's name, that gave us a lot of kudos in this town. Like, it became apparent that we're actually, that there was so much respect for Russ and Marge, and because they are a package, we've talked about, lots of people have talked about that today, but it was, we found that even now, 26 years later, we're still kind of living off having that, that connection with Russ. And when I think about Russ, and I was so sad when he wasn't well and he was dying, but and I've often thought about, maybe we get to meet a handful, maybe you can count them on one hand, just inherently good people. We all have our flaws, things that, we're not perfect, but Russ just seems like one of those perfect people. He was just genuinely, I've never met anybody quite like him, where he's so genuinely interested in the person that he's talking to at the time. And I got to realize that over the year, it wasn't just us that was special. It was everybody in Russ's life that was special. And he was just such a, his spirit is still here. You can, through his family and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren, you kind of know that Liechty vibe that Russ and Marge have passed on to their family, and we are so grateful. They did so much for us when we moved here, that just not bringing us to Goshen, but getting us connected with so many people and acting as references for us when we were looking for jobs. And we're just another international family that he helped, and Marge. So we're very grateful for all that they've done for us. We certainly wouldn't have succeeded here without them. Thanks.
I'm Rachel Nafziger-Hartzler, and I first met Russ in the dean's office when I was a student. I had been summoned there because I had missed too many chapels. Going back a few years, I knew the Lichtys. I grew up in Pettisville and knew many of the aunts and uncles and the cousins there. They were, in fact, my third cousins. My dad was in class with Herman and Harold, and they were second cousins. And so I knew these families, but I hadn't really learned to know Russ. Fast forward then to 1969. My dad died suddenly, and I was home for his funeral and other events, and had a hard time getting up and getting to chapel when I did get back to campus. So I got too many missed chapels. I was a little nervous going to see Russ, but it was all, any nervous anxiety melted away as soon as I sat down, and he welcomed me, and with most gracious and kind words heard my story, and I left there feeling heard, feeling comforted, and inspired to get up in time to go to chapel.
I think I have two things to say about Grandpa. The first is that I don't think anybody has mentioned Liechty family vacations on Lake Michigan. Those vacations where we would go up to Onekama in Michigan and spend a week on the lake with Russ and Marge, my grandma and grandpa, and all their kids and all their kids' kids, I think have played a huge part in my life. They're the reason I know and love all my cousins in the way that I do. I think, and the spirit of grandma and grandpa presided over that week and brought the family together in a way that I don't think a lot of extended families are close in the way that we are. So I really appreciate that. But the other thing I wanted to say was sometimes it's hard to go from being a young kid knowing your grandparents to being an adult knowing your grandparents. And what I remember of grandma and grandpa when we were kids was just the tractor rides and the love. And when I came over to college and then graduated, I had a really hard time in my early 20s and mid-20s and late 20s. And I often felt like it was hard to live up to the Liechty family legacy. My grandparents and parents had all lived lives of adventure and service to God and gone to India and Nepal and China and Ireland and done these sort of amazing things that got their pictures put on cards and put on people's fridges, pray for the Liechty family, because they're off doing something cool somewhere. And I was not doing anything very cool in my 20s. My brother and I, Aaron, moved to Denver, and we were living in a series of really crappy little apartments and basements and not doing our dishes and having part-time jobs and just not getting on anybody's fridge. And I remember at one point, Grandma and Grandpa came out to visit us in Denver. I forget which of our crappy apartments this was at. I'm sure we didn't host them in the way they would have hosted us. But they took us out to eat, and I remember them being so interested in our lives, which, as I said, were not much to write home about, and asking us questions. And I think I had always felt before that trip that somehow we were like letting down the family by not doing all the cool things we were supposed to be doing. And there was absolutely none of that in the way they talked to us. They were interested, they were encouraged. I forget exactly what they said, but it was sort of like, this is just life, you just figure it out. And there was no judgment from them on our lives or the way we maybe hadn't done what we thought we would do by that age. And I so appreciated that about Grandma and Grandpa, that they let us figure it out for ourselves and loved and supported us.
I have already been crying thinking about saying this, so I know I'm not going to make it through. My grandpa always made me feel special. I'm Elsie, the youngest granddaughter of Russ. I was the only baby that my grandpa ever saw being born, and so he was one of the first people in my life. I was really happy that they lived here in Goshen while I was in college, because moving in and out of the dorms twice a year at least was a pain, and there was always big furniture to move and mini fridges, chairs, and all that sort of thing. And so when I started college in 2017, he still had the pickup truck that was, bluish green with the tan stripe and uncomfortable carpet seats in it. And it was manual, which meant I couldn't drive it by myself. And so he would come and he would help me move into the dorms every year and out of the dorms. And there's a picture in here somewhere of him sitting on the back of the red pickup truck, and he was helping me move in and out of the dorms. It got to a point where the furniture was pretty heavy, and I didn't want him to help me move it anymore. I appreciated him being there, but I didn't want him to try to help me carry the mini fridge down 3 flights of stairs. So I started carrying it by myself, which was fine. I was able to do it, and after we were done, he'd always say, "Man, you're so strong. I can't believe you carried that all by yourself." And he would tell my dad, he would tell my family, like, "Man, she was carrying that mini fridge all by herself. She didn't even ask anyone to help." And it just made me feel so special. I'm really upset that he wasn't able to see me graduate this past spring. He helped me move out of my last house from college as I was away this spring semester. He came and helped me move out. And so all through my college he was there, and he would help in little ways. And I know he would be proud of me, but it was very hard to go through that, and we miss him a lot.
I guess I'm lucky enough to say I was the youngest. Oh gosh, I'm gonna cry too, all three of us. The youngest of Russ's grandchildren. Sorry. But one of, I guess, I was lucky that I was his youngest, but also unlucky that I didn't get to spend as much time with him because of that. One of my favorite things, I know that I love attention, and he was somebody that was very easy to please, and so I can name so many times where I would tell a joke that wasn't hitting, and there was always one person I could count on to laugh. Some of my fondest memories were our lunches that all of our family in Goshen would have every week after church. Sorry. And I remember one time in specific, all of the youngest, myself and Moses, Levi, Jesse, and Isaac, one statute of the house is that every time we go there was 2 jars. One had jelly beans and one had peanut butter M&Ms. And as soon as we got there, we'd all race to get the peanut butter M&Ms. The jelly beans, we wanted them, but the peanut butter M&Ms were the treat. And I remember one time in specific, I was the first one to get there, and I savored a few peanut butter M&Ms, and then I came back a little bit later, and they were all gone, and I was mad, so I was looking for who had them. I was mad looking through the house for Moses. I come to the family room, and I see Grandpa munching on all the peanut butter M&Ms, and I found the thief. So that was a fond memory, and I also remember the signature meal of Russ, in my opinion, I don't know if others would disagree, was the pork chops. There's also a photo of that somewhere, and he knew how to make a pork chop and a corn on the cob. And I remember also that when I had braces, I was not allowed to eat the corn on the cob because it would break the braces. And I remember him taking the time to cut all of the corn off of the corn on the cob so that I could eat it as well.
we want to thank you all so much for coming. People are certainly welcome to stay, and I always, these things, I remember when I got married, I remember feeling like I had barely talked to anybody that day, and I feel that way today, and I'm so thrilled to see you all here and to hear some of your stories. We'll stay around if you have time to talk. That's great. Again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for celebrating the life of our dad. Thanks.